And Maria.
Good afternoon. I have the honor of leading in prayer. Let us pray. O God, who loves each one of us as a mother loves her child, O God, who loves all the peoples of the earth, be with us in this time of opportunity to build reconciliation with First Nations, the people who first occupied the lands which we enjoy. And we pray that as we are blessed with hearing the words of Cecelia today, that we will go from this place committed to the real meaning of building life and hope together. Amen.
So it is my great pleasure to introduce Cecelia. I've had the pleasure of meeting Cecelia, and I'm not going to tell you guys how. I think you might be able to figure that one out, since Cecelia is John's firstborn child. Firstborn or first family, maybe not born through normal methods, but she is still the first in John's family. And so, first child. So it is pleasure. Cecelia has been, she said, I asked her what motivates her to speak. She has spoken to over 3,000 people in this past week since last Monday. So why? Why? And she says it's for the truth, to speak the truth so that we all learn the truth. And she says she's followed in many very noble footsteps, including her two dads. And so on that note, welcome, Cecelia. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this time and space with us.
Thank you. Thank you. So nice to be here. There's some people in here that I haven't seen in many, many, many years. So yeah, it's funny. It was funny as I was driving up Marmont Street and got past Austin, and then I think is it still called Ridgeway Street? So there used to be a Safeway, and I remember my mom, she had an account there, and so if she needed me to pick up something, I could just go in and pick up, I didn't have to pay, and they would just mark it on her account. Those were memories I remember, how time has changed. I remember there used to be a bookstore, and I loved to read as a little girl. I loved to read, and there was this used bookstore, and I would be able to go in and trade in my books, and then she would give me credit so that I could pick up new books. And it's funny because Nancy Drew was somebody, I read all her books, the whole series. Any of you in my age group, you'll know those little yellow books, the hardcover and all the mysteries, and I love them. And I often go into either thrift stores or antique stores, and if I see Nancy Drew books, I open it up, because if you're in my age group, you signed with your name on the inside cover and typically your phone number. And so I check to see if mine is there. And I do it all over the province, everywhere I go. So, you know, those are just funny little memories that actually connect you to land, to place, to memory, which is so wonderful. So it is nice to be here. I am thinking I will share a lot about my story through my perspective. It will not be 100% accurate. Dad, you can correct me if you like. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and why even yesterday, Orange Shirt Day and the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And I mention Orange Shirt Day first because Orange Shirt Day began before the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Orange Shirt Day began because of a young girl named Phyllis who went to residential school and had her beautiful orange shirt that her granny had bought her, and they took it away from her and put her in a uniform. And I've had the opportunity to meet Phyllis many, many times. And the Canadian government decided one of the calls to action was to have a day to recognize truth and reconciliation. And probably, I don't know, with the support of Phyllis, landing on that day of September 30th, but I think it kind of got lost, the orange shirt and September 30th, that meaning. So it's really important that I do both, that I recognize both those days. So yesterday was a great day. Thank you to those who are wearing orange shirts today. I tell the kids that I work with in schools in Langley, you can wear your orange shirt any time of the year. And you can share the story and you can share the truth about this history that we're all coming to terms with. Every single Canadian is coming to terms with this history. We're all in very different places of this history and understanding, but we are moving forward as a country in the right way, in the right direction. Yes, there are some who are wanting to pull us back a little bit, but I think we collectively have to stand together and ensure that reconciliation continues to move forward. So just a little bit about me. I work for the Langley School District. I'm an Aboriginal cultural presenter. I started that about 8 years ago. And so I work with students from grade 5 to 12. And they are amazing. They're amazing. They're learning this history that some of us have a hard time understanding, but they're just learning it, and it's just acceptable and easy to comprehend. Whereas sometimes adults get defensive, or we don't know how we should feel, or we feel guilty, even though we shouldn't really feel guilty, but we don't know what to do with those emotions. But kids are just accepting. So oftentimes, when I'm sharing this, I start in grade 5. Grade 5s, if you ever want social justice, if you ever want something done, go to grade 5s. They will get it done. They're amazing. They understand right from wrong. They get it. So when I talk about this history, they're like, this is so wrong. How did this happen? How did this happen? And then they want to make change. So to me, it gives me great hope with the work that I do, that we are making change. And then I say, go home and talk to your parents. I'd love to be a fly on the wall some days. Go home and talk to your parents about this history I've explained. Go home and talk to your grandparents about this history. Because even for me, I didn't learn this history in school. We studied Indigenous people, but it wasn't in the truth, in the way that it should have been taught. And they were very cautious. I often say congratulations to the federal government of Canada for keeping all this so secret. But now a secret's out. And now we have to come to terms with the secret. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening with a good heart. Sorry, not used to wearing this. A good heart and a good mind as we go through this presentation. I will try and keep it down to about 45 minutes, and then hopefully we can have 15 minutes of questions if we wanted to. So going way back to when I came into this world, this is Butedale. Butedale was a fishing cannery on the north coast of British Columbia, just south of Prince Rupert. And my birth mom and her parents and her brother lived in Butedale. They worked for the cannery and they lived in Butedale. Indigenous people would also work in the cannery. And so my biological dad, who I will say is Cecil, also worked there. And Cecil and my mom, Marguerite, had a relationship. And out of that relationship, the product of that relationship was me. Unfortunately, to be a 15-year-old girl, raised Roman Catholic, Caucasian, pregnant by an Indian, as we were referred to, was very taboo. And Marguerite's my birth mom. Marguerite would explain stories to me that she would say, your grandpa did not want an Indian granddaughter. And so she knew she would have to give me up. She knew she would carry me for 9 months, and the plan would be to place me for adoption. And I don't think there was any real discussion. It was just, she was told this is what was going to happen. So Butedale was a very small community, very tight-knit community. Many of the people from the Haisla First Nation, which is the nation I come from, would come and fish out of the cannery. So a lot of them knew my in the community today, a lot of them knew my grandparents. And the stories that I hear, I get to learn a little bit about them, even though they're no longer here. So in June 4th, 1963, yes, if you're doing the math, 61 years ago, I came into this world, born in Prince Rupert. And my mom, Marguerite, often tells the story of I was placed in the back of the nursery with a floor-to-ceiling curtain around my bassinet so that if she walked by, she would not be able to see me. She never saw me. She never held me. She knew she had a girl. She knew she had a daughter. She named me. She named me Cecelia. That is where my name comes from. My adopted parents did not change my first name, which was really important to Marguerite. Many years later, the very first question she asked was, what was my name? What name was I given? And when she was told that my name was still Cecelia, that was really important to her. So in this picture on your top left, that's my mom, Sharon, my adopted mom, Sharon, holding me. I'm about 6 weeks. I went into a receiving home after being released from the hospital in Prince Rupert, went to a receiving home for about 6 weeks, and then went to John and Sharon after that. Dad was a minister. At that time, Mom was an elementary school teacher. Dad was a minister in Lac aux Lambs. Back in 1963, was known as Port Simpson, but now referred to as Lac aux Lambs. And Lac aux Lambs was our home for 3 years. You were there but after I was born, probably about 3 or 4 years. And the people of Lac aux Lambs were incredibly an important part of Mom and Dad's life. Although I was very young, I connect a lot on Facebook with people from Lac aux Lambs who know me and remember Dad and Mom, which is amazing. But Lac aux Lambs was a big part of our lives. And even once we left Lac aux Lambs, Mom and Dad stayed connected to families in Lac aux Lambs. So it was kind of like this distant relationship that we had with people, but I was still connected to Lac aux Lambs. And same with my brothers, Harvey and Ben, and my sister Judy, all knew those relationships and those stories. Here I am in the middle, and this is Mom and Dad's good friend. Mom and Dad's good friends were Louise and Murray Smith from Lac aux Lambs. And Louise and Murray would often help Mom and Dad. When Mom had the twin boys, they were only a year younger than me. I still have no idea how my mom did it. Like 3 kids, 13 months and younger. How did she do it? I don't know, but she did. But Aunt Louise, who we grew up calling her Aunt Louise, would often come over and help Mom with the boys, with the twins. And then Uncle Murray's job was to look after me and keep me entertained. Well, that was kind of the roles that were shared. This is Aunt Louise and Uncle Murray's children, so Sue and Tom. And then they have one other older boy. But Sue and Tom and I connected, amazing story, which I'll get into. So they are a big part of my life. Here I am growing up. As you can see, some of you may recognize me in different pictures throughout my life. It was interesting. I don't have a physical memory of being told that I was adopted. I don't remember a conversation of sitting down and being told I was adopted. I think that word adoption was used all the time before I could even understand it. I certainly knew that mom and dad were my parents, that my grandparents on both sides, my grandma on my dad's side and my grandma and grandpa on my mom's side, were my family, aunts and uncles, all of the people that were significant in my life. I don't remember that conversation. I did go through school here from grade 5 to grade 12 in Coquitlam. And eventually, I met my husband. And we've been together 37 years. So 37 years last month, or in August. Dave and I had our firstborn son. This is David. David today is a big guy, works for the film industry, kind of covered in tattoos. He's kind of a free spirit kind of guy. But he was the very first person, when I held him for the first time, the very first person I was biologically connected to in my whole life. 24 years. I had never been biologically connected. And so when I had David, it was incredibly powerful for me to hold him. And I realized I wanted to know my truth. If we're talking truth in all sense, I also needed to know my truth. I needed to know the story. I needed to know what happened. Because really, all my mom and dad knew, all that they could give me was, my mom was a 15-year-old girl, French-Canadian background, that my dad was Indigenous. I think that's all you knew, pretty much. There wasn't a lot of information that was given to adoptive parents back then. And so when I had David, I decided I needed to know more. I needed to know the story. I needed to understand who I was. And so in November, I decided I would search out for my birth mom, and I found her. I found her very quickly. It didn't take very long, less than 24 hours, I think, for me to place the phone call and then to be told, we've just talked to her. It was less than 24 hours. Mom and dad had always been supportive, even through my teenage years, would often say to me, when you are ready to search, when you want to know, we will help you. And so I always knew that door was open. I always knew that avenue was open. I did tell mom and dad that I was going to be initiating my search. And again, supportive. No idea that within 24 hours I would be meeting my birth mom. She had registered with Parent Finders. I registered with Parent Finders. They entered the information that I had, which was, I was born on June 4th, 1963, in Prince Rupert, to a French-Canadian woman and an Indigenous man. That's all they knew. That's all I had. And they plunked in all that information, and lo and behold, a French-Canadian woman giving birth on June 4th, 1963, in Prince Rupert, had registered many years before to find me. And so that connection was made. This is the night we met. It was the very first time I met her. Her name is Marguerite. And this is in her home. She gave me all the answers I needed. She told me everything I needed to know. And her and I, when my kids were little, my kids called her Grandma Marguerite. My mom, Sharon, was Grandma. But this was Grandma Marguerite to my kids, and they knew who she was. She would attend the birthday parties, the family dinners. Dad, you remember when my kids were having birthday parties? Marguerite was there. Her husband, Peter, was there. Sadly, Marguerite didn't have any other children. I was her only child. And part of that, from her story, from her truth, was that her dad had fixed her so that she couldn't have children after me. And that was, part of her punishment for embarrassing the family, for causing so much trauma to the family. So I think, Marguerite had a difficult life. She was raised in a very abusive home for the most part. But she was thrilled to meet me, and she was thrilled to tell me her story, her history, our family history, and I got to know her quite well. Our names are important. Marguerite had named me Cecelia. That was my first name, Cecelia. It would have, on my original birth certificate, would have read Cecelia Marie Demers. That was my original birth certificate. When I was adopted and you go through the Supreme Court, they change your birth certificate. And so now, today, my birth certificate is Cecelia Ann Cashore. But that first name was kept. And it was important to Marguerite that it was kept because she was, had very dear friends in this remote community who were from Kitimat, which is the Haisla Nation. And there was a young girl named Cecelia. And there is Cecelia. And Cecelia Grant was actually very close to my grandparents, my birth grandparents, which is interesting because you have to wonder, like, my grandfather had relationships with Indigenous people. But he couldn't have it within his family. That was going to be too much. But he did have relationships, and Cecelia was one who was very important to the family, the Demers family, my grandmother, my grandfather, and Marguerite, my mom. And so I am named after Cecelia. Cecelia was killed in a car accident when she was, I think, 15. And so there was a group of girls, 3 of them, who said, whoever has the first baby girl, we'll name her Cecelia. That's where that name comes from. Names are so important because they tie us to stories and history. Here is Cecelia again with my birth grandparents, my birth mom's parents. And when I went back to Kitimat, one of the first few times I went back to Kitimat, and I'll get to that story, I kind of bounce around, just bear with me. When I went back to Kitimat, I met Cecilia's mom. And Cecilia's mom's name was Adelia. And I had a chance to meet Adelia, and she was the most lovely, beautiful woman that I've met. And Cecil, my birth father, had taken me to meet Adelia. And so he said to me, we're going for a walk, put your jacket on. So I put my jacket on and I followed him around the village to this house. And we got to this house and Cecil's dad knocked on the door. And this older woman opened the door. And Cecil is talking to her in their language, which I don't understand. And he is explaining who I am. I am named after her daughter, Cecelia. And she starts to cry. And she looks at me. And then she touches me. She holds my face. She wants to touch my hair. It was so beautiful. It was so incredible because part of our culture is when we're named after somebody, we carry them with us. We carry them with us. So I have her daughter, Cecelia, with me. Adelia passed away a number of years ago while I was visiting in the village. And their family, the Grant family, called me to say, would I come and sit with them the night Adelia died? Usually the first night when somebody passes away in our community, it's just the immediate family that comes the first night. And then after that, it's everybody in the village will eventually come by over the few days. But they wanted me to come and be with them, which was very profound. We were cleaning out my grandmother's things after she passed away. And we found original letters written by Cecelia to my grandma. I met this boy. We danced at the dance. All the typical things a 13 or 14-year-old girl would write about. It was wonderful. But I got those letters. I have them. I also made copies for Adelia and all of Adelia's children, Cecilia's siblings, all of who I'm very close to today. So names connect us. Lands connect us. Stories connect us to each other. This picture is a very important picture to me. This picture, after I met Marguerite that first night, my birth mom, I asked her who my birth father was. She didn't have to tell me the truth. She didn't have to tell me who he was, but she did. She offered me that information, and she said, your father's name is Cecil Paul. He comes from Kitimat Village. She didn't really have anything nice to say about him. Okay, I understand that, right? That's emotional. But at least she shared with me his story and who he was. And that night, I came home after meeting Marguerite, and I phoned my mom and dad, John and Sharon, to let them know how the reunion meeting my birth mother went. And I said to mom and dad, there were landlines back then. Mom was downstairs and dad was upstairs, so two of them were listening on the phone to me, and I'm in Langley. And I say to dad and mom, Marguerite told me who my father is, and his name is Cecil Paul, and he comes from Kitimat Village, and I think I'd really like to meet him. And Dad, would you be able to help me? Because there was a United Church in Kitimat, and I thought maybe the minister might be able to connect us. Something would happen. And my mom said into the phone, but basically talking to my dad, John, isn't Aunt Louise's maiden name Paul? And didn't Aunt Louise come from Kitimat? Mom said, I'm going to phone Aunt Louise and see if she knows who Cecil Paul is. And so Mom hung up the phone with me, and she phoned Aunt Louise in Prince Rupert and said, Cecelia just found her mom tonight. Mom is saying Dad is Cecil Paul. Cecelia would like to find him. Do you know who he is? Aunt Louise said, I have to go, but I will call you back. And they hung up the phone. And then Aunt Louise picked up the phone, and she called her older brother Cecil Paul. This picture is me with my first cousins. 24 years later, I was connecting to my family. But I wasn't only connecting to my family, I had been connected to them my whole life. We just didn't know. Interesting, when we got my adoption file from the government, they knew. They knew I was being placed very close to my biological family, and they weren't going to do it. They weren't going to allow the adoption to go through. But the social worker that I had, and that Dad and Mom had, fought for the adoption to take place, to go ahead. So, the secret had been kept. Now, what happened was my birth father, Cecil Paul, knew he had a daughter. He knew he had fathered a child. But he told his mom, my grandma, my mameo, told her that he had a child, but he didn't want anybody else to know. So the two of them kept it a secret for 24 years. And nobody knew about me. So connecting through my family with Story again, with Sue and Tom and Aunt Louise and Uncle Murray and the community of Kitimat was amazing. It was amazing. This picture, though, who would have known 24 years later that we would be connected? Here I am meeting my dad, December of 1988. You can imagine what I was going through. This was crazy. But there you see my mom, Sharon, Cecil, myself, Aunt Louise. And then you see my husband, Aunt Louise, Cecil, myself, my youngest David, and then Mom and Dad there. Actually, Cecil was flying down for medical, and so Aunt Louise came with him, and he agreed to meet me. And we met in a hotel room in downtown Vancouver, where we spent the afternoon together, him and I and Aunt Louise. And then Mom and Dad had wanted him to come for dinner. And so we came out for dinner, and Mom and Dad also had a chance to meet Cecil and then see Aunt Louise. And it was an incredible evening. One of the first words that Cecil ever said to me was, be proud of who you are. Be proud of who you are. And I certainly was proud of who I am. And really, who am I? I am a product of much love from many different directions. Community, people who have known me for years, family, biological or not, we're family. Here I am receiving my traditional name, Nuyamzits Extuquia is my traditional name that was given to me by my Aunt Louise. We flew up to Kitimat, Dad and I, because Dad was going, there was another celebration happening at the same time. So Dad and I hopped on this little plane and flew up to Kitimat in the winter for a celebration event, but also I was given my name, which was really incredible, and the button blanket. And so there is Aunt Louise, myself, and my birth father, Cecil Paul, and I'm dancing for the first time in front of my community, really discovering who I am. And I'm discovering the true history of Canada that I didn't know about, because Cecil would share stories with me about the history of Canada. And I'm going to talk very briefly about this history because it's important. And there is much to learn, so I can only touch on different things, but things to think about. This gentleman, Sir John A. Macdonald, is the one who began residential schools. And he began it to assimilate Indigenous people into our broader dominant society, as they referred. Residential schools became law. We had them about 30 years before 1886. We began to see them in Canada in about the 1950s, but it became law that all Indigenous children would be taken to residential school, and that happened in 1886. The last residential school closed in 1996, but we now know that's changed. It is now 1998. Things will change. Those numbers are going to change slightly as we begin to get documents released, as more documents are being released, as we begin to study different schools. So right now, the last residential school is now closed in 1998. But Cecil had gone to residential school. And Cecil had actually gone to 2 residential schools. This is a picture of him as a little boy. It's the only picture that the whole family has of him. This is his first residential school. This is the Elizabeth Long Memorial Home in Kitimat. And where we come from, where Cecil comes from and my family comes from, is the Kitlope. And the Kitlope and Kitimat amalgamated to become one nation. So Cecil would not have been living in Kitimat at that time with his family. His family was living further away. And Cecil came to this residential school, where he stayed for about 10 months. And then his dad, who ended up being my grandpa, came and picked him up to take him home to the Kitlope for the summer. And during the summer, Cecil said, I don't want to go back to the residential school. There are bad things happening. I don't want to go back. And so my grandpa, probably an incredibly brave man, although I never met him, took Cecil, and they went into hiding for about 4 years. They lived out on the land. It was the best 4 years of Cecil's life. He talks about those days of learning the names of the mountains, of learning which species of fish come up the river and what time of year, and what time of year it is best to hunt for deer or moose or bear, how to preserve, the responsibility of looking after the land. All these things, his education was on the land. And it was the best 4 years of Cecil's life. And then one day, they went back to the community, and there was an RCMP officer there. And that RCMP officer saw Cecil. And that RCMP officer took Cecil and sent him to what was the Alberni Residential School on Vancouver Island. This residential school was run by the United Church of Canada. I have Cecil's report cards. These are report cards. They are not given to our families. They were given to the government of Canada to let them know how the children were doing in residential schools. But I have them all because there was a wonderful young lady who wrote Cecil's book, which is out there. Thank you for bringing the book. which is out there. And in order to make sure that Bryony was documenting everything correctly, she was able to get a lot of documents that helped tell my story, including the report cards. And so if you, sorry, just a sec. If you go all the way down to the bottom, you're not going to be able to read it, but I will help you. Number 126, it says Cecil Ball. Number 126. He is 11 years old. He's from the community of Camano. He is in grade 3. His chores are farming and gardening. That's what he was assigned. He has done 300 hours of chores that quarter. And he's making satisfactory progress. This is one page of many pages of the students at that time who were at this school. And I'm able to tell Cecil's story. My hope is one day all these children will have their story told, that we will document them. I often talk to high school teachers on Pro D, and I will say, my hope is one day you'll take these names and you'll ask the students to research them, and they're going to have to reach out to the community, and they're going to have to learn about this child and figure out what their story was and then be able to tell their story. It's so important. The person above Cecil Paul is Leonard Paul, his brother. And Leonard is 15 years old. He's from the community of Camano. He is in grade 5. And he has done 400 hours of chores so far. All these children come from many different communities around the province. And again, this is just one page of many pages, but they do tell a story. Cecil spent 4 years at this school at Alberni and suffered tremendous abuse. Tremendous abuse. The worst thing you can imagine that somebody could do to a child was done to him. I don't need to say what happened. You know. You know that truth. He left that residential school at the age of 14 and a really angry young boy. He was very angry. He would talk about being angry. He had a grade 5 education, although he didn't know how to read and he didn't know how to write. So I don't think it was really a grade 5 education. It was just a way of assimilating him and making sure that the children were living in that dominant society role. So Cecil lived until he was 90 years old, and he never knew how to read, and he never knew how to write. Cecil left that residential school and he got a job on a fishing boat that he hoped would take him north to his mom. He wanted to go home to his mom and his dad. He didn't know that during the time that he was in Alberni that his dad had passed away at a very young age, my grandfather at a very young age, due to tuberculosis that was spreading not only in residential schools but across our country. While on the fishing boat, he was given a drink of alcohol. And he was only 14 years old. And then he had another drink of alcohol and then another. And he realized very quickly that if he drank enough alcohol, he would forget everything that happened to him in Alberni. And that was his coping skills for a long time, for many years. He told me this story of him and his best friend, Russell. They came from the same community. And Russell and Cecil were like brothers. Russell and Cecil went to a movie theater. Cecil loved wartime movies. That was his thing. So there was a wartime movie playing at the theater in Prince Rupert. And so Russell and Dad went in and they bought their ticket and they went in and they sat down in the theater. And the usher came over to my dad and she said, "You can't sit on this side of the movie theater. This side of the movie theater is for whites. And that side of the movie theater where you have to go is for Indians and people of color." And Cecil and Russell refused to move. And so the usher called the RCMP, and the RCMP came and arrested him and Russell for sitting on the wrong side of the movie theater. These are important things that we have to talk about, important stories that we need to share. There were on many restaurants, on the outside of a restaurant door, it would say whites only. If you're a person of color, you might be able to go in the restaurant, but you'd have to enter the back door, sit in the back of the restaurant. And then some restaurants you weren't even welcome to go into. This is important to know. I talk about this all the time with kids. This is really important to know because in our country, and we see it in this country, and we see it in the United States more, well, we're very polite in Canada. We have racism in Canada. We're just not so blatant as the United States. It is important to have those conversations. I was talking to a grade 5 class the other day and sharing this story. And this little boy, and I said to him, to the class, I said, the reason I share this story is because you have to know that there was racism in this country and that it was really bad. And that we were segregated. People, not just Indigenous people. Many people were segregated. And that's important that we know that so that we don't do it again. And this little boy who was in grade 5 put up his hand and he said, I have been called a nigger 5 times since the beginning of school. Oh my God, it broke my heart. And the teacher, I looked at her and she nodded her head. It was true. Little kids were calling their little schoolmates names like that. So when we talk about the truth, it is really important that we listen to the truth, that we react to the truth, that we do something about the truth. And for this little boy, I told him how strong he was and that he has a place in our world. And that was important to him, for him to hear. Meeting Cecil, I learned a lot about the history of Canada that I didn't know about. I learned a lot about the United Church that I was raised in, that I was baptized in, that I chose as a teenage girl to be confirmed in. The United Church was a very important part of my life. But I was trying to reconcile this history. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to Vancouver. That's when I really started to learn the truth. That's when I really started to hear the stories. Some of you may have been there during that time to come to Vancouver and hear those stories. I know that Dad, John, and my mom walked the walk for reconciliation with one of the churches. Cecil was here in town. He testified at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I was walking with him in the walk. And it was pouring rain, and it was cold that day, and we were walking. And Cecil was crying. He had tears going down his face. I said to him, they're all walking for you. Like, to understand this history, to share this story. They're all walking for you. And it was very important, and it was very healing for him. The other thing that was really healing for him was, and he talked to my dad and mom about this, and it's in the book. How can I be so angry at the church? He had been angry at the church for a long time. How can I be so angry at people who are involved in the church when the very person who adopted my little girl and raised me and looked after his daughter in such a loving way was a part of the United Church? And so I think it was very healing for Cecil. As difficult as it was very healing to have a relationship with mom and dad. And they did. I've had the relationships with both my birth parents, with both my parents. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to Ottawa. It was the final closing event in 2015. And I wanted to go. I wanted to be in Ottawa for it. And I wanted to go by myself. I said to my husband, book me a ticket, get me a hotel room. I want to be in Ottawa for the final event. I want to hear what Justice Murray Sinclair and the other commissioners were going to say to Canada. And I wanted to be there to hear it. And so I did. I went to Ottawa. I took part in the Walk for Reconciliation. I was staying at a hotel near Ottawa, near the hotel that it was being hosted at. And every morning I would take a taxi down to the main hotel where the event was happening. And I had been there for like 4 days. And I got, one morning, I got into the cab, and he had been the same cab driver for 3 days. The same cab driver had taken me. It was his parking spot at this hotel. So I get into the cab, and I have my cedar hat. I have my drum. I have my button blanket. And I get into his cab, and I said, you need to take me to Gatineau, Quebec, where I'm going to be joining thousands of people doing a walk from Gatineau, Quebec to downtown Ottawa. And so off we went. He had never really talked to me, other than, where are you going? But all the cab drivers in Ottawa, the evening before the walk, got an email that said there are going to be thousands of Indigenous people in your city, and you're going to be driving them wherever they need to go. You're going to be respectful. And like basically just letting them know that this was going to be happening and this was big. And this taxi driver said, yeah, I got this email, and so you must be one of them. Like, yes, I'm one of them. You're going to take me to Gatineau. But he said, I don't understand what this is all about. His English was broken English. He was obviously new to this country. And so I said to him, this is complicated. This is complicated history. But I'll try and explain it in a way that might make sense to you. I thought, how do I explain this in like a 10-minute cab drive? The whole colonial system in the last 200 years. How do I even make that happen? But what I said to him was, you are new to this country. Yes. And I said, if you had to come to Canada, and when you came through those gates to enter Canada, if you had to agree that you were never going to speak your mother tongue again, if you were going to agree that you would never eat your traditional foods again, if you had to agree that you were going to wear the colonial system's clothing and not your own traditional clothing, and you were going to practice a religion that came to this country from as the Canadian government words it, the dominant society, you were going to practice that religion, would you really agree to come to Canada? Would you really want to come here? And he said, no. And I said, well, that's what happened to Indigenous people who were already here. We had to give all that up. And that's what this is all about. Because it wouldn't have happened, residential schools wouldn't have happened if the government was not determined to assimilate us. But they were determined to assimilate us. He said, I understand now. He said, I'm going to get on my radio and tell everybody about this. And I said, great, good, thank you. It is sharing stories. It is sharing these stories, one person at a time. That's all it is. You are learning the truth. You might be hearing things that are new today. You might not be hearing things that are new. Some of us are on very different paths of reconciliation, in very different spots in reconciliation. But I do ask you to share our truth. I do ask you to share this truth. Without these two men in my life, these two most important men in my life, they taught me a lot. I am who I am today because of them. And I'm proud. I am very proud. A few years ago, we discovered the remains of 215 children at the residential school in Kamloops. That awoke the nation. That awoke the nation. I think people knew things were going on, but that really shook us to a core. Indigenous and non-Indigenous people shook us to a core. I had to go to Kamloops. Within a couple of days of the announcement, I went to Kamloops. And while I was heading into Kamloops to the residential school that perhaps you've all driven by and see, on the highway, they had placed crosses And then they had little dresses on those crosses. And as I drove into Kamloops, it was so emotional, and it was incredible because thousands of people were coming to Kamloops to get a sense and feel what was happening. And I spent the day there, a very emotional day there. And I came home to Langley. And for a number of days, I had contemplated what I was going to do. What could I do? What difference could I make? Because people were really hurt. Indigenous and non-Indigenous people were hurt. So what I decided was there was a park in Langley, and I phoned the mayor, because I know him. He's part of my Rotary Club. And so I phoned the mayor of Langley, and I said, hey, I'd really like to use one of the parks. Can I use a park? I want to do an art installation in one of the parks, in memory of the 215 children that were discovered, and in memory of all those that still have not been discovered. Because let's be honest, there is more that we need to find. He agreed. He said, yes, you can use the park. You can have any park you want. Do whatever you want. It's totally good. I'm like, thank you. I found another organization, and I said, I need a little bit of funding because I want to do something. I want to buy clothing for 215 little souls. And I found a company, a wood company, who agreed to make me 215 crosses. And we took those clothes. I went out and bought all these clothes, and I bought beautiful little dresses. And I bought a little fireman outfit, and I bought a little mechanic outfit, and I bought little shorts and sandals. And we put those clothes on the crosses to represent the children and how they couldn't have dressed. Those little dresses that were so cute and adorable, they would have been in a uniform. That wouldn't have been the clothes that they would have had. And so at this park called Derrick Doubleday Arboretum in Langley, I placed 215 crosses. I had no idea what would happen, but people came. From all over the Lower Mainland, people came. People wanted to be there. Last night, we held a candlelight vigil there at the park because it's where the people in our community in Langley come to gather. It's the gathering place in memory. So yesterday, I don't know, we had probably like 500 community members, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We did a candlelight walk. We had 60 Indigenous drummers who were there, and we just walk in silence. And we remember. And we remember. And that's what I'm asking you to do today, is to remember. To hold those little souls in your lives. We need to remember those who went to residential school. We need to remember those who never came home. We need to know that we have to find the truth. We have to tell the governments that it's not okay, that you don't fund the search of every residential school in this country. They have to fund it. We have to do the search. We need to know the truth. Those things have to happen. I want to thank you for having me today. I want to thank you for listening to this history. It's a lot to take in, but it's important. It's important that we learn and we try and understand, and that we have empathy and compassion for where everyone is in our world today. Tragic news on the other side of the world today as the war is going to step up again. It's scary what's happening. It's scary what's happening. And the reason that we teach it, the reason we talk about it, is so we don't do it again. We don't do this again to anyone. And that the very fact that we're still in war tells us we don't really learn. We don't really learn. Otherwise, we wouldn't be there. We've already done, World War I, World War II, all the different wars. And yet we're still fighting over land. We're still fighting. And it's horrible. It's horrible. But I do want to say thank you for having me today. I want to, it's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to be here with my dad and Cherie, so thank you. I went on right up till the end. That's okay. I'm going to say if there are any questions, we can spend like just a couple of minutes. Otherwise, I'll let Cherie explain. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer a couple. And if there's not, that's all good. Hajka. We put our hands like this, and we just say Hajka. Hajka CM means thank you. Yes, Hajka, Hajka. Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Oh, good. That's good. Mm-hmm. Oh.
Now we know Cecelia's truth. It's our job to continue these stories and to try to make things right. Thank you, Cecelia, for sharing. Yeah, I'm seeing. So, on that note, thank you all for coming. Thank you for hearing firsthand. Thank you also for understanding now why she was given the King Charles Medal as she continues to tell her truth and others' truth. So, we have food. So, if you wish, please, there is lots of food. Coffee, tea, help yourselves. Eat. Cecelia, are you going to stick around for a little while? There. Okay. Please. Yes, Laura. The book. Yeah. Laura wants to know about Cecil's book. I believe that's what you're asking. Books, there's actually 2. Do you want to address that, Cecelia?
Sure. So the one out in the lobby is Stories from the Magic Canoe. So there was a lady who's become a very dear friend of mine named Bryony Penn, who lives on Salt Spring, but met Cecil several times. And they became very close. Bryony, over the years, recorded all of Cecil's stories. She would record and listen to Cecil's stories. And then she transcribed it. So Cecil, although he couldn't read and he couldn't write, and he lived until he was 90, he's a published author because Bryony took his words and his recordings and transcribed them word for word. So the Stories of the Magic Canoe is Cecil's words, Cecil's stories. Then there's another book that was written by Bryony Penn about Cecil, which is Bryony's teachings from Cecil, so in her words, but about Cecil. So they're wonderful 2 books, but they were really important to me because my kids will have the legacy of the stories of Cecil as he shares his whole truth through those books. So yes, there is one out there, and I think they're still available. You can probably find them online, but also bookstores have, libraries have them, and also, like, I know I've ordered hundreds, but like you can get them on Kobo if you do Kobo and different things as well. So definitely worth checking out.
If I may indulge, there's a story I'd like to tell that has to do with both of Cecilia's fathers. And that is, when I was the Minister of the Environment in British Columbia, I was involved in a program to double the protected areas of the province from 6 to 12% of the province in the interest of saving God-given tracts of land and forests. And it turned out that 6 months after I met Cecil, when he came to our house, that he led a delegation of Indigenous people from the Kitimat village and from the Kitlope area, which was his family traditional territory. And they came to Victoria to meet with me. And working with these people, we managed to protect the Kitlope Valley, which is the largest unlogged rainforest in British Columbia. And that's been protected for all generations. And it's just a wonderful thing to think that Celia's two dads were able to put that together.
Yep.
Thank you, Cecelia. Eat.